In this episode, I sat down with my dad, a political mind I deeply respect, to break down what's really going on in the Middle East, what Trump may be doing behind the scenes, and how it all ties back to America. If you're tired of shallow news and ready for truth, this episode is made for you. Alright, so last week I had my dad come on, and he talked a little bit about Israel and Iran and the United States involvement. And a lot of people really enjoyed it. So this week I figured I would sit down with him and do a one-on-one interview, especially since we have had a lot more happen in the last week or so between Israel and Iran and the U.S. And I thought it would be really important to kind of just have a sit down with him and talk it through with him and see what his thoughts are regarding the recent news. We have had the U.S. bomb the nuclear facilities in Iran, and then Iran retaliated by shooting missiles at a U.S. military base in Qatar. We had a ceasefire, and then Israel broke the ceasefire and shot missiles again at Iran. So I figured my dad would be the best person to have come on and cover this conversation regarding what's currently going on in the country, because there is just so much to get into. But before we do, I do want to go ahead and dig into the verse of the day, because I think it's really important. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. John 16:33. I think that is super important to remember right now, especially with all of the things that's going on in the world. It's easy to get fearful. It's easy to, believe the media on everything. And we really begin to be very, very fearful of everything going on. And so I think it's important to remember that, Jesus has already overcome the world. As a Christian, I have so much anticipation in spending eternity with Christ. He has already overcome this world, and I think it's super important to remember, because I think we tend to forget that a lot. All right, so if you are not in our CCW Facebook community, I really encourage you to go and join our Facebook group. We have such good, fulfilling, wholesome conversations there. We talk about politics, theology, family, marriage, all of the wonderful things. I have linked it in the show notes so you can go and join. Make sure you answer the membership questions, because if you do not answer them, you will not get access to the group. We are very specific about that and who we let in. So make sure that you go and answer the membership questions and read the About Us section, because that's also super important. And again, we would love to have you. We love to continue to build our community and have more and more women who are seeking to speak freely about their conservative political views and their Christian values. So if you would also please leave me a 5-star review and share this podcast with a friend, that would honestly mean the world to me. I love it when y'all share this podcast, because it shows me that y'all truly enjoy it. And so if you would be willing to share this podcast with a friend, send me proof at voicesoflibertycontact@gmail.com, and I will send you an exclusive CCW sticker in the mail, because I think it's super important to make sure y'all know that I really appreciate my listeners. You can also follow me at The Patriot Isabel on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Okay, y'all, so Trump, just dropped another bomb, but this time it was the F-bomb on national TV. So I have a lot I want to say about this. First of all, clearly he is frustrated. He is frustrated with the situation going on. This happened right after there was a ceasefire between Israel and Iran, and essentially Israel broke the ceasefire, and Trump was really, really mad. So clearly, again, he's frustrated at this point, and I don't really blame him. I mean, there's a lot going on. So today I want to dig into all of this on the podcast and have my dad talk about it. After Israel broke the ceasefire, Trump basically just said, we have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard, they don't know what the F they're doing. And, you can say what you want about language. It's not really great. It's not, the best thing to say on national TV at all by any means. But I think he's just clearly showing his frustration with both nations. And he has a point. I mean, they've been fighting for so long, they don't know what they're doing. And so I think it's important to note that, he's a person, he's a human, and he is going to get mad. He's going to have faults. He's going to get irritated. I'm not making an excuse for him for saying that word, because it's not good. But I think at the same time, we have to remember he's a human being. He gets frustrated. He gets mad. He gets irritated, just like the rest of us. And so I think it was kind of funny too at the same time, because he's clearly saying they don't know what they're doing. They're they're just mad at each other, and they've just been fighting for so long. It's ridiculous. And so I just wanted to bring that up because I thought it was kind of funny that, Trump doesn't hold back, y'all. He doesn't hold back at all. So I thought that was pretty comical in a way. So we're going to be diving into the interview with my dad today. His name is Jared Denton, for those who don't know. If you didn't listen to my episode last week, he did make an appearance, and I just let him talk for most of the time about Israel and Iran because he did predict what would happen pretty spot on. So if you haven't listened to that episode, go ahead and listen to that episode right now. I'm going to go ahead and be diving into this interview, and I'm super excited. All right, so I did want to go ahead and preface this and say that in this interview, my dad mentioned something called BRICS, and it's basically just an acronym. I think he said that the S stood for Sudan, but that's actually not true. It stands for South Africa, and he wanted me to go and correct this before the interview was conducted because he accidentally misspoke on that, and I did our research to double check after the interview, and it is South Africa. So if you hear him talk about BRICS and you hear him mention Sudan, just know that he actually means South Africa. He just misspoke on that one thing. All right, so the first question is, what do you believe is the biggest foreign policy failure of the current administration?
The biggest foreign policy failure of the current administration, and it's probably not just the current administration, I would say it's probably all previous administrations, at least probably going back for the last 30 years or so. And that is going most likely to be, at least in my opinion anyways, is the approach that we've taken with China. So for people that aren't aware of what's happening, when the United States fights a war, it's a kinetic war. It's if you think about it in terms of military action, it's one military against another. As far as China is concerned, they have a total war concept or mentality, meaning they wage war on multiple different fronts, and the planning for that is considerably longer than what the United States plans for. So we get war weary very quickly, and you don't have to go back that far to kind of look at that. Like the last great war that we fought was probably World War II, which enjoyed about a 90% approval rate amongst our Congress alone. Think about every war that followed that, and that wasn't the case. And so Americans have grown very, very weary of war. But yet, when we think of war, we think about a war being kinetic. And so China, when they think about war, they think about it in multiple fronts. So for instance, the logistics supply chain, if they can considerably reduce the ability for us to get resources, then we can't fund a war. We can't fight a war. If they can considerably reduce the amount of people that we can have serving or that qualify to serve in our armed forces, that too considerably weakens the United States military. So for years, China's been funneling fentanyl into the United States, not so they can gain some sort of economic or financial incentive from it, but it's really to weaken the United States, because you think about the demographics of those people that are addicted to fentanyl. It's fighting age males for the most part, and so they're pretty much reducing the pool of candidates that are capable of serving in the armed forces. And you can go back just a few years. The DEA made one of the largest busts in the history of the DEA as far as cash busts, where they raided a hotel room. I think it was in Mexico. There were 2 Chinese scientists and a stockpile of cash of about $900 million. And those Chinese scientists were here in Mexico teaching the cartel how to make fentanyl. So they're working with the cartel to funnel this stuff into the United States in order to, again, wage this kind of total war mindset. And that there's a lot more that goes with that. The Belt Road Initiative, which you can talk about further. BRICS, which is basically an economic alignment of multiple countries. These are all aspects of their total war concept, and there's so many fronts to it that the United States has failed. Our policymakers and our government has failed tremendously at addressing this. And so now we're in a very, very vulnerable spot that I don't think most people realize.
All right, next question is, how has U.S. policy towards Israel shifted in the last decade?
So to answer that question, you have to go back to really to say maybe 1979. Around that time, Egypt and their relations towards Israel changed. Anwar Sadat was essentially the leader of Egypt at the time. They wanted to formalize relationships with Israel. And shortly thereafter, I say shortly thereafter, but in the 90s, I think it was in 94, Jordan followed suit, and that they also normalized relations with Israel. And so you had these two countries that kind of normalized these relationships so that they could benefit from that economically and partner with them agriculturally, medically. There was just a very normalizing of relationships. Well, nothing changed from that point on until really just the last 10 years or so. So basically that whole period of time between, say, 1979 and within the last 10 years, we've had kind of this status quo relationship with Israel and with other Middle Eastern countries, i.e. like Jordan and, say, Egypt. That status quo relationship really existed on the premise of they recognized that the United States was essentially going to be the ones that were kind of ensuring this, the security of the Middle East, and they were okay with that. So we were kind of like the big brother, just kind of standing on the sideline watching over everything. And there was a sense in which they understood that we kind of supported, at least publicly, a two-state solution. We enjoyed this idea of bringing some degree of peace between the Palestinians and Israel. And all that was very public-facing statements that the United States, our government, our policymakers would make. And that created a sense of contentness, I guess, with these other nations that had normalized relations. And so what happened in the interim around 2013 with the Arab uprising was there was this revisionist kind of view, meaning that certain nations in the Middle East aligned to look not at the United States as kind of the big brother that was bringing security to the Middle East, but rather had a more hostile look at the United States. And so mixed in with that was Iran. They were kind of the focal point. And Qatar, which is at least in some ways been allied with the United States. In fact, the U.S. base that was bombed by Iran was in Qatar. But they largely aligned with this revisionist mentality as well. And so it was really more for their own sake that they did that, because Iran was kind of the leading that effort. And so they wanted to kind of make sure that they were aligned with the right side. So I say all that to say this, right? Like, the United States has held to this status quo type position for years. And that up until 2013, most of those countries in the Middle East were content with that. The Abraham Accords essentially brought in even more countries recognizing and formalizing that relationship, which again are all built on this idea of kind of economic prosperity, right? So whether it be agriculture, tourism, the medical field, all these different components of their economy, all these nations kind of agreed to work together for the overall economic benefit of each of them. So this kind of revisionist view that kind of come or spun out of Iran, which in some ways people were having to choose which side to take. And in the process, we seen an opportunity, or at least maybe Trump seen an opportunity to capitalize on this kind of status quo view with some of these other nations in the region by promising, again, economic prosperity and all these other things, which brought all these other nations into these Abraham Accords. And so that's kind of inflamed things even further, whereas Iran, Turkey, even some of those other countries have become even more kind of anti-America. And so I would say probably the answer to the question is that within the last 10 years, the United States has not just held to the status quo, but doubled down on the status quo and formally recognized Israel. Again, this was part of moving the capital to Jerusalem. That's kind of what stimulated some of these other countries coming into these Abraham Accords. And so there's this large-scale recognition of Israel, which was not at all what some of those other countries wanted. Iran being namely the primary aggravator, and then again Turkey, Qatar was mixed into that. As far as our relations with Israel are concerned, I don't think from a governmental standpoint there's nothing, there's no sentimental reasons for it. There's no theological reasons for it. I think in this current administration, particularly with Trump, there's a lot of ego involved, and so I think in his part he wants to be the one to claim that he's brought peace to the Middle East. I don't know that he necessarily actually cares about bringing peace to the Middle East so much as he does about stroking his own ego, and either way it works out for everybody. So I think that's probably the biggest reason, or the biggest shift.
Okay, so we are going to take a second to pause so that I can tell you about one of our partners.
Does your morning cup of coffee help save lives? Probably not, unless you're buying from 7 Weeks Coffee. 7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company on a mission to fund the pro-life movement one cup of coffee at a time. They have the best coffee, and again, I love it. So a lot of you may be asking, why are they called 7 Weeks Coffee? Because at 7 weeks, the baby is the size of a coffee bean, and it is the same time a heartbeat is clearly detected on ultrasound. That is why they donate 10% of every sale to support pregnancy care centers across the country. They have raised over $900,000 for these centers and have saved thousands of lives. Y'all just think about that for a minute. Like, I want my coffee to come from 7 Weeks Coffee because I know that with every sip I take, I am helping save lives. It's absolutely beautiful. Now, let me tell you about the coffee because I am very picky about what I put into my body. It's mold-free, pesticide-free, shade-grown, low acid, and it's organically farmed. So it truly checks all of the boxes. So go to 7weekscoffee.com and save 15% forever when you subscribe. Plus, exclusively for my Voices of Liberty listeners, use my code OFFICIALCCW for an extra 10% off your order. That's a 25% total savings on your first order. Y'all, you cannot beat that. So remember, your order is going to directly go to help support a network of over 1,000 pro-life organizations across the U.S.
All right, so next question. In your opinion, what are the biggest national security threats in the United States right now, and how do Iran and Israel play into this?
So again, the biggest national security threat, I believe, facing this country, and I think most other people that are at least paying attention agree that it's China. And as far as China being a threat to the United States, they're not just a threat to the United States, they're a threat to essentially the world order as it is today. With respect to Iran and Israel playing into that, I don't know that Israel has much influence in that, but Iran certainly does because of the fuel supplies or the oil that China gets out of Iran. So in order to have a machine, you got to fuel the machine, and they get a significant amount of oil out of Iran, and so that definitely is going to impact China in many respects, both industrialized aspects and as well as military aspects. It affects a lot of things. So as far as Iran and how they play into that, that's probably the extent of it. Clearly we've seen that their military really doesn't have much to offer by way of trying to come in and provide any kind of assistance to China in that respect. So I don't think there's anything there, but China certainly is the biggest threat to the United States, and again, it's something that can't be emphasized enough. It's a total war mindset, just to reiterate it. Everything from the logistics supply chain to the drug epidemic in our country to the COVID virus, even potentially. There's so many different aspects that China is fighting this, because the idea is if you have a nation that's much, much stronger and more powerful than you, then if you can weaken that opponent over a long period of time and just wear them down until you get to a point where you can take them down, then that's when you act. And unfortunately, the United States doesn't think long term that way. Again, we get very war weary, so we don't think about war from a total war mindset. We think about it as a very kinetic thing that happens. One nation beats another militarily, and they declare themselves the winner. China doesn't look at it all like that. They're trying to impact our economy. Again, the health and welfare of the population. The logistics, supply chain, all of these different aspects serve to weaken the United States. And when we get to the weakest point, then they'll flex, and there's very little that we can do about it. One of the things that is probably the most concerning is, and this is some statistics that I just heard recently, but I think it was last year, the United States Navy had a plus 8 when it came to building ships, but they decommissioned 12 for a net loss of 4 ships, whereas China is building a very robust Navy. The problem is that our debt is so high right now, and our military budget is the highest it's ever been, that there's just not room in the budget to produce ships at the rate that we did during World War II. And China has largely stayed out of all of these kind of wars that have gone on the last 20 or 30 years, and they've just spent all that time throwing money at their military, building this massive military. So to go back many, many years ago, there was a point in which China was threatening Taiwan. This isn't anything new, right? There's always been kind of this sense in which China was going to kind of take back Taiwan or take Taiwan. And so there was probably 3 decades ago a point where China was attempting to flex on Taiwan, and in the process, the United States sent several battle groups through the Taiwan Strait, I believe it was, as a means to demonstrate, or a show of force, rather, to China, which in turn served its purpose because China backed down. Well, for anybody that may be paying attention or remembers this, not long ago, Nancy Pelosi got on an airplane and flew to Taiwan. It was the first time that somebody that high in our administration has gone to Taiwan and kind of formally recognized Taiwan. And so it was a big deal. And there was all kind of concern as to whether or not China was going to shoot her plane down and all this other stuff, right? Well, none of that happened. But at the end of the day, what did happen was when Nancy Pelosi left, in the days that followed, China flexed and put on this massive military demonstration, which proved to the world that they had the capabilities that they had claimed to have all along, and was essentially a repeat of what we did to China 30 years ago when we showed them the force that we have and caused them to back down. So when they did that, it was essentially repeating what we did to them as a demonstration to the world what kind of force they have and what they're capable of. And I think it put a lot of people on notice. I think, again, it's a little bit of a distraction too, because, again, we're not just talking about war from the standpoint of military confrontation, but China looks at it from a total war mindset. So we can all be looking in one direction while the whole time they're devastating other aspects of a nation, whether it be the economy or the health and welfare or whatever it is, right?
Why is Iran so hostile towards Israel, and how long has that tension been brewing?
So the whole thing goes back, again, all the way back to, you could essentially say back to 1948, right? So I think you addressed this last time I was on here, but prior to 1948, the Jews were dispersed, and they really had not ever had their own homeland, right? As far as a nation defined by borders, recognized borders, a government, they didn't have any of that. And so because of the widespread, persecution of the Jews that were kind of spread throughout the world, predominantly out over in Europe, right? They, after World War II, they agreed, or they kind of gained this independence and were able to establish a nation. But in the process, they displaced about 700,000 Palestinians in establishing Israel as a nation. And so this created a lot of tension in the region. And there was a name that they had used for it. Translated into English, it means catastrophe. So the Iranians look at this as the great catastrophe, right? And a lot of those Middle Eastern nations kind of adopt the same view of it. So there's been tension going all the way back to the origin of Israel as a nation. Again, that hostility has only increased over the years because of what we just talked about recently with respect to this kind of status quo relationship and this revisionist type relationship, whereas Iran began to look at the United States in a more hostile view, not necessarily as the big brother kind of standing on the sideline. And of course, because we are aligned with Israel, their hostility is also directed towards Israel. And let's just be honest, like Iran, I think, wants to be the premier country in the Middle East that everybody kind of bows down to, right? And so there's this competition, I think, within the Middle East amongst some nations to kind of be the big dog on the block. And there's probably 1,000 other reasons involved in that. I mean, there's no one thing I think that could define it, but to just go back to the original question, I think it largely goes back to 1948, maybe even prior to that, with the displacement of the Palestinians and the Great Catastrophe. That's when these tensions started to brew, and that's when this animosity, I guess, towards the Jewish people began to ferment, so to speak.
So how close are we really to being in a war in the Middle East, and how does this pull in the United States?
I think as far as a regional war is concerned, we've been in a regional war with a large part of the Middle East for the last 20-plus years with the war on terror. That being said, as far as nation-on-nation type war, I don't think that's even right now even a plausible thing. There's really Iran, the whole thing lasted 12 days, and really Iran had pretty much depleted most of their significant weapon systems that they had been using. So there's really no threat there, I don't think, at this point. Now, whether or not they still have any nuclear material, there's questions about whether or not whatever enriched uranium that they had produced was smuggled out of the country or some secure location within the country, how long it would take them to actually use that in some sort of bomb that could potentially create a regional war. Who knows? I don't think there's any desire for a regional war. In fact, there was an article that was released today that basically in the next few weeks the administration is probably going to announce that many, many other nations are going to jump into this Abraham Accords along with the nations that already have to normalize relations with Israel. More and more, some of these hostile actors are being isolated. And when you look at countries like Qatar who are trying to align themselves with the winner, the more that the majority lines up on Israel's side, eventually they're going to line up there too, because they want to align with whoever is ultimately the winner, right? And that was kind of what led to their alignment with Iran originally. That said, the only other threat you really have is Turkey. And I think Erdogan, who is the president over there, has had enough issues of his own, especially during kind of I think it was the Arab uprising, that there was a lot of controversy. And so I think if he were to try to get involved in some sort of regional war, it would probably be the end of his presidency. At any rate, it just doesn't seem like there's anything really brewing that's going to create the conditions for a regional war that we would actually have to be involved in. Syria is pretty much not a question anymore. The government's been overthrown. Russia, that had a large influence in Syria, had so much going on in the Ukraine that they pulled out pretty much all of their forces and resources from Syria, which was the only thing really holding up the existing government and ultimately allowed them to fall when they pulled out to the resistance or the rebel fighters. And so they're restructuring their government now, trying to rebuild their nation. Iran definitely is going to have to spend many, many years, if not decades, rebuilding what Israel has just destroyed. And you only have a couple other nations over there that even have the potential, one of them being Turkey, the other Egypt, and neither of them seem to really have a desire to be involved in anything like that. So I think there's not a threat at all there.
Can you break down what Israel's current strategy is against Iran?
So I think militarily the strategy was to neutralize them, which they effectively did. And I think through these Abraham Accords, I think it's to isolate them. So they've been effectively neutralized, and then when they've been effectively isolated, they're only going to have one of two choices. If they want to continue to exist and prosper as a nation, they're going to have to get on board with everybody else, which will probably mean that the people in Iran will ultimately cause their government to be overthrown internally in order to make that happen, because what's going to end up happening is they're going to see all these nations around them flourishing, and they're going to be under all this oppression, and they're just not going to want to live like that forever, at least in my view. So I think at some point there'll probably be a toppling of Iran's government, and that was kind of the point, I think, all along with Israel, was to succeed in reshaping the government of Iran.
What is the role of oil, energy, and gas during these tensions?
Well, I mean, so you have a lot of, that's a larger question probably, but there's so much going on. Probably if people want to get a better view on this, there's several, on any of these questions, there's several people that can answer these questions probably far better than me, but so just so people are aware, if they want to go out and listen to some of Eric Prince's interviews, Eric Bethel's interviews, or Peter Zehan, who's a geopolitist who seems to understand especially the oil and gas aspect of it far better than I do, and the demographic aspect of it as well. But at the end of the day, I think it plays a significant influence in many of these conflicts that are currently existing. So, for instance, in the Ukraine, I don't know if, it wasn't, just a couple of years ago that the oil line in the ocean or the gas line in the ocean was blown up. And what that ultimately ended up doing was cutting a significant amount of energy provision to Europe. And so if you look at Germany right now, their energy costs are skyrocketing because that line was blown up, and so they're having to get energy from multiple different sources now, and so that has a significant impact on their economy when you think about in terms of production, industry, the different aspects of the industries that they have, just general housing and the population. And it could potentially economically break that country. Now, whether that was the plan, I don't know. But I do know that that's played a significant role. That was, again, one of the leading reasons that not long ago Russia, again, encroached into the country of Georgia, was because of energy. Now, on the Middle Eastern front, again, most of the world's oil, at least for a long time, most of the world's oil came from the Middle East, and so OPEC pretty much controlled those prices. There's a lot of things happening in the energy industry right now that are going to potentially upset that, and so a greater reliance on natural gas, a greater reliance on solar, and other forms of energy. Probably the biggest thing right now that's going on is the research and development into fusion energy. And if that ever happens, it renders OPEC useless. But there's a lot of investment being made in this area, significant amounts of investment being made in this area. So I think that's probably, it remains to be seen how our traditional forms of oil and gas or energy are going to play into current or future conflicts, but they definitely have an impact on it. And the United States has made efforts to extract its own oil for its own use, kind of this isolationist mentality, whereas we're not relying upon somebody like OPEC. And I think that's probably a good idea. But again, there's only so much to go around. So eventually you have to start moving into more alternative forms of energy. And I think that's why this push for fusion energy is probably so great right now, because most of what we've learned from alternative energy is just it's just not as efficient as they claim it is, and so it's not a long-term solution to the problem.
So what do you think the mainstream media is intentionally leaving out of the coverage of Israel and Iran?
So I think probably the most glaring thing is the history of both of these nations and the conflict between them. When people, especially the people that are going to have some degree of influence and peace in that region, i.e., the United States, maybe places like China or Russia, when the average person, particularly the United States, because we obviously have a much more democratic process in our government, but when we are fed information and we don't do our own due diligence to research to understand the issues so that we can properly align ourselves, and we arbitrarily kind of vote people into office who maybe either they may not know the issues either, and so they're taking a position or a stance based off of some sentimental reasons or because of their theological views or whatever the case is, and they've never even really studied the issues themselves. And I think that's a very dangerous way to operate. I think it's important, especially if you're going to bring peace, or be a broker of peace or a mediator in this conflict. It's important to know both sides. And I think most people that have any influence or say-so on any of this, any of the influencers, anybody, they just don't know the history. They're accepting what they hear as sound bites as fact, and that's just not the case. And so I would encourage everybody to read and do research. Again, speaking of the threat that China poses to the United States, again, it's a little off subject, but there's not probably many people that have researched too much about China's Belt Road Initiative or China's BRICS, and I say China's, but really just that alone with BRICS. It's a economic alignment of nations, which essentially the outcome of that, as more and more nations are brought into that, is that it's going to transition the world from the U.S. dollar as its standard reserve to the Chinese yen. So what that means is that the United States will essentially cease to be the economic power that we have been for so long, almost overnight. And that would have an unbelievable impact on every person that lives in this country economically. And China is actively doing that now through this relationship with, and again, the acronym is BRICS, which originally stood for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I believe the last one, S, was Sudan. But now there's many other nations involved, and you can actually go online and look at a map of all the nations that have expressed interest in joining BRICS, all the nations that are a part of BRICS, and all the nations that are in talks with those officials that are kind of overseeing that about joining BRICS. So I think, again, when it comes to the media, whether it's the war with Iran and Israel, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, the average person just doesn't take the time to research the facts, and they're just content with sound bites, and that they use that oftentimes to form their own kind of, at least what they believe to be, informed opinion. But it's really not an informed opinion. We're not getting information from the media anymore. We're getting sound bites. And if we want information and we want long-form interviews and facts, we probably need to turn to podcasts, and we need to turn to books and research the history. And I think if we do that, we're going to find out that these issues are a lot more complex, and we're going to find out that they're maybe even in some cases that we've aligned ourselves with the wrong side. And we just have to be humble enough to admit that and change course, and probably allow that to inform how we vote in the future as well.
So I want to go ahead and circle back to this. I know we kind of mentioned it before already, but what is your take on the Abraham Accords, and how is it making an impact today?
Yeah, so again, the Abraham Accords were nothing more than kind of a formal recognition of Israel, where these other nations initially, again, we had, it was the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and I think it was Jordan and Morocco that followed suit. that joined the Abraham Accords. Pretty soon there was people like Saudi Arabia and other nations in the Middle East, other more Muslim nations that were at least showing interest in joining the Abraham Accords. And this whole thing was really built around the idea that they were going to kind of formally recognize Israel in a way that helped them to develop economically, both through tourism, agriculture, all these different aspects of their economies, so that they could all prosper together. And that's gained a significant amount of traction. I think probably now that Iran has, for the most part, been neutralized and they're not the big brother out there anymore, kind of overlooking all of these smaller nations, kind of as an imposing force, kind of threatening them. I think what you're going to end up seeing is that there's going to be a lot more nations now begin to align themselves with Israel through entering into these Abraham Accords. And so I think it's been a good thing. There's definitely issues with it. They're not major enough, I don't think, to really even address, but it's definitely had an impact on the region. It's definitely had an impact on the relationship between some of these nations and Israel, and it will continue to have an impact throughout the region.
All right, my next question is, do you think that Trump is quietly setting up a strategy for war or for peace?
Unfortunately, I don't think Trump has a strategy. I think Trump just plays things by the ear from day to day. And I think Trump obviously wants to align himself with the winner too, because, again, whether you like it or not, and whether you agree or not, I think it's important that we address things as they are. You know, whether you like Trump or dislike Trump, I think everybody can agree that Trump has a very big ego. And with that, he wants to align himself also with the winning side too, because he doesn't want to look like a loser. In fact, he's made comments in the past, even when it comes to our POWs, that they were losers because they got taken POW. Like, again, he just doesn't want to align himself with a losing force. So when we go back, say, to the White House and his meeting with Zelensky, he shut Zelensky down in front of the media. And I think in large part it was because Trump was, at the time, kind of aligning himself with Russia, because Russia was essentially, without Ukraine having the support of Europe and the United States, they would have probably already been decimated. And so Trump knows that. And when we pull out our support from the Ukraine, it's pretty much a guarantee that Russia's eventually going to win this war, which then ultimately threatens the rest of Europe. But that's another podcast probably. But I think that there's not a strategy other than aligning with the winning side. And ultimately, yes, I think he wants peace, but I don't think he necessarily wants peace for the sake of peace. I think he wants peace for the sake of his legacy and his ego. I think he wants to be known as the one who could do what nobody else could. And in large part, that's how he's being recognized even this last week in NATO, at the NATO summit in The Hague. The NATO chief basically called Trump daddy and told him that he was able to do what no other president in history has been able to do, which, again, only fed that ego even more. So I don't think there's a strategy that's leading to war or peace. I think Trump is aligning himself with whoever it looks like the winning side is. And then ultimately, once peace comes into that region, he'll be aligned with the winning side, whatever the case, right? And he'll be the one given credit for it. So, I mean, if that's a strategy, I guess. But, regardless of how we get there, whether we get to peace through a man's ego or through a man's desire to truly seek peace, I don't know that really matters that much as long as we see peace. Now, I think it bears keeping in mind, too, that peace is only temporary between nations. Without Christ being center of that, there's not ever going to be peace. And so I think as far as Christians are concerned, and I know I said this last time I was on here, but as far as Christians are concerned, there has to be an emphasis on evangelism and the gospel, because without that, there isn't going to be real peace.
All right, last question, and it's, what do you believe most Christian Americans get wrong when it comes to Israel?
Yeah, so I think that when it comes to Israel, we have to understand that Israel is a nation, not a people. Old Testament we can look at Israel as being a people, but as far as Israel is concerned today, Israel is a nation. And the people of Israel are Jews. And Jews are not Christians. And when I say that, traditional Orthodox Jews is what I'm talking about. There are Messianic Jews who have put their faith in Christ. And then the other part of that is that for those who are not Orthodox Jews, and those who are not, the very small minority of those who are not Messianic Jews, are largely secular. And some are Arab, right? Or not, maybe not Arab, but are practicing Islam. And so in that sense, right, like we have to look at Israel not as a people, but a nation. But we need to look at the people in the nation as lost, because that's exactly what they are. And while we want to believe that they're God's people, if you want to be truthful about that, right, like everyone belongs to God, which is why he has the authority to do with us what he wants and what he wills. The question is whether or not they're serving the Lord Jesus Christ and whether the Lord Jesus Christ is truly their Savior. The Bible tells us that a man must be born again. And we know that happens through the person of Jesus Christ. And so without that, they're not Christians. And I think as far as Christians in our view of Israel, we have to look at it in terms of not that they're God's people, right? That the Christians are God's people. And our job is to evangelize and share the gospel even with those people in Israel, those Jews who are there still practicing Judaism, those who are practicing Islam, those who are secular. It doesn't matter. So I think there's this kind of Zionistic view from the Christian community in the West, and unfortunately, I think that stems from, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but what I'm saying is that I think it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of Scripture, just a basic ignorance of what the Bible says about Israel and about the people of God. And I think it stems from, unfortunately, a lot of sound bites in which people are just not aware of the issues because they're not studying them. And instead they're listening to sound points or even sermons in which Israel is being promoted as this kind of mantle or centerpiece of God's larger plan, right? And I think that's probably not a good view to have. I think we need to look at it in terms of God has brought out of Israel a Savior, and that Savior was Jesus Christ, who was a Jew, and he's grafted in the Gentiles, as Romans would say, and in doing so will cause his own people to grow jealous of the relationship that exists between the Gentiles who were former alienated from God and desire to have that same relationship, so eventually drawing them back. But again, that only happens through the gospel of Jesus Christ.
All right, so I wanted to go ahead and tell you all about one of our partners really quick. Do you want a way to boldly share truth and your values without even saying a word? Conviction Company has you covered. Conviction Company is a family-owned business started by a Midwest stay-at-home mom. Their goal is to provide their customers with high-quality and on-trend apparel and accessories to make it easy to boldly share truth and spark important conversations. Go to convictioncompany.com and use the code OFFICIALCCW to get 10% off your order. Conviction Company has the most coolest hats you could ever imagine. I have 3 or 4 of them. I have the Save the Babies hat, Make America Healthy Again, and One Nation Under God hat, and I always get compliments on them, and people always ask me about my views and values, and I think it's super important to boldly share that wherever you go, and I love to wear my hats from Conviction Company. So go to convictioncompany.com and use the code OFFICIALCCW to get 10% off your order today. All right, everybody, that is my dad, Jared Denton. He is able to explain things so well, so I really am so thankful that you are here to be able to answer these questions and really just explain everything so easily. All right, y'all, I hope that this interview is able to really just offer y'all some insight and encouragement with what's going on in the world right now in the Middle East. I think that, during this time, like I said earlier, it's really easy to get fearful, worried, and, we can tend to forget that the Lord is on the throne.
He knows everything that is happening and what is going to happen, and we have to trust him. We cannot continue to live in fear every day, because that's not doing anything for us. Every morning, y'all, I want you to get in your word, pray, and really just lean into Christ, because he's the only one who can give you peace. I appreciate every single one of y'all. I really hope, again, that y'all love this episode with my dad. He's really good at explaining things, especially things like this that can be really hard to comprehend and understand. So I really hope that, y'all are able to enjoy this episode, understand a lot, and y'all are walking away a little bit more educated on the matter. And again, I want y'all to continue to navigate life with liberty, truth, and grace, because it's so important.